Upton Sinclair, A Capitalist Primer. Review of the Jungle by Upton Sinclair. The Atlantic, July and August 2002. Probably no two words in our language are now more calculated to shrivel the sensitive nostril than socialist realism. Taken together, they evoke the tractor opera, the granite-jawed proletarian sculpture, the cultural and literary standards of Commissar Jardinoff, and the bone-deep weariness that is paradoxically produced by ceaseless uplift and exhortation. Yet these words used to have an authentic meaning, which was also directly related to social realism. And the most fully realized instance of the genre, more telling and more moving than even the works of Dickens and Zola, was composed in these United States. Like Dickens and Zola, Upton Sinclair was in many ways a journalist. His greatest novel was originally commissioned as a serial for the popular socialist paper Appeal to Reason, which was published, this now seems somehow improbable, in Kansas. An advance of $500 sent Sinclair to Chicago in 1904, there to make radical fiction out of brute reality. The city was then the great maw of American capitalism. That is to say, it took resources and raw materials from everywhere and converted them into money at an unprecedented rate. Hogs and steers, coal and iron were transmuted into multifarious products by new and ruthless means. The Chicago system created almost every imaginable kind of goods, but the main thing it consumed was people. Upton Sinclair tried to elucidate and illuminate the ways in which commodities deposed and controlled human beings. His novel is the most successful attempt ever made to fictionalize the central passages of Marx's Das Kapital. The influence of Dickens can be felt in two ways. First, we are introduced to a family of naive but decent Lithuanian immigrants, sentimentally portrayed at a wedding feast where high hopes and good cheer provide some protection against the cruelty of quotidian life. There are lavishly spread tables, vital minor characters, and fiddle music. Second, we see these natural and spontaneous people being steadily reduced, as in hard times, by crass utilitarian calculation. They dwell in a place named Packing Town, and steadily reduced is a euphemism. The extended family of the stolid Jurgis is exposed to every variety of misery and exploitation, and discovers slowly, necessarily slowly, that the odds are so arranged that no honest person can ever hope to win. The landlord, the saloon keeper, the foreman, the shopkeeper, the ward heeler, all are leagued against the gullible toiler in such a way that he can scarcely find time to imagine what his actual employer or boss might be getting away with. To this accumulation of adversity, Jurgis invariably responds with the mantra, "I will work harder." This is exactly what the innocent cart-horse boxer later says as he wears out his muscles on the cynical futilities of Animal Farm. Orwell was an admirer of Sinclair's work and wrote in praise of the jungle in 1940. But Sinclair may have been depressed to see his main character redeployed in the service of allegory. Sinclair's realism, indeed, got in the way of his socialism in more than one fashion. His intention was to direct the conscience of America to the inhuman conditions in which immigrant labor was put to work. However, so graphic and detailed were his depictions of the filthy way in which food was produced that his book sparked a revolution among consumers instead, and led at some remove to the passage of the Food and Drugs Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. He wryly said of this unintended consequence that he had aimed for the public's heart, but had instead hit its stomach. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them, and they would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. This is no fairy story, and no joke. The meat would be shovelled into carts, and the man who did the shovelling would not trouble to lift out a rat even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. To this, Sinclair added well-researched observations about the adulteration of food with chemicals and colouring. He also spared a thought, as did many of his later readers, for the animals themselves, especially, and ironically in view of Animal Farm, for the pigs. At the head, there was a great iron wheel about 20 feet in circumference, with rings here and there along its edge. Upon both sides of this wheel was a narrow space into which came the hogs. Men had chains which they fastened about the leg of the nearest hog, and the other end of the chain they hooked into one of the rings upon the wheel. So as the wheel turned, a hog was suddenly jerked off his feet and borne aloft. At the same instant, the ear was assailed by a most terrifying shriek. And meanwhile another hog was swung up, and then another, until there was a double line of them, each dangling by a foot and kicking in frenzy and squealing. It was too much for some of the visitors. The men would look at each other, laughing nervously, and the women would stand with hands clenched and the blood rushing to their faces and the tears starting in their eyes. Meantime, heedless of all these things, the men upon the floor were going about their work. Neither squeals of hogs nor tears of visitors made any difference to them. One by one they hooked up the hogs, and one by one, with a swift stroke, they slit their throats. Again, the demands of verisimilitude have a tendency to work against the recruitment of any sympathy for the calloused and even brutalized labourer. Sinclair's title, The Jungle, along with indirectly evoking the ideology of Thomas Hobbes, inverts anthropomorphism by making men into brutes. In her rather deft introduction, Jane Jacobs dwells on the passage above and on the sinister implications of machine civilization, without registering what to me seems an obvious point. Sinclair was unconsciously prefiguring the industrialization of the mass slaughter of human beings. The principle of the abattoir applied to politics and society by the degraded experimenters of the assembly line. Eugene Debs, the great Socialist Party leader and orator of that period, announced that his ambition was to be the John Brown of the wage slaves. This noble hyperbole was not all that much of an exaggeration. The lower orders in Chicago may have come voluntarily to escape a Russian or a Polish house of bondage, rather than being brought by force from Africa to a house of bondage. But once here, they were given only enough to keep them alive until their bodies wore out. Their children were exploited too, and their womenfolk were sexually vulnerable to the overseers. Indeed, the most wrenching section of the book comes in the middle, when Jurgis discovers that his wife has been preyed upon, under threat of dismissal by a foreman. Not following the socialist script in the least, he sacrifices self-interest for pride and pounds the foreman to a pulp. By this means, he swiftly discovers what side the courts and the cops and the laws are on, and is made to plumb new depths of degradation in prison. Among other humiliations, he stinks incurably from the materials of the plant and offends even his fellow inmates. We are not spared another Dickensian moment when he realizes that he has been jailed for the Christmas holidays and is overwhelmed by childhood memories. Sinclair interrupts himself at this point to quote without attribution from the Ballad of Reading Gaol. Oscar Wilde was not long dead in 1905, and it seems a sure thing that Sinclair would have read The Soul of Man under Socialism, the most brilliant line of which says that it is capitalism that lays upon men the sordid necessity of living for others. Robert Tressel's novel The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists, 1914, is the only rival to The Jungle in its combination of realism with didacticism and its willingness to impose a bit of theory on the readership. In both proletarian novels, the weapon often deployed is satire. The workers are too dumb and too grateful for their jobs to consider the notions that might emancipate them. Jurgis had no sympathy with such ideas as this. He could do the work himself, and so could the rest of them, he declared, if they were good for anything. If they couldn't do it, let them go somewhere else. Jurgis had not studied the books and would not have known how to pronounce laissez-faire, but he'd been round the world enough to know that a man has to shift for himself in it, and that if he gets the worst of it, there is nobody to listen to him holler. But gradually, after being for so long the anvil and not the hammer, he awakes from his bovine stupor and comes to understand that he is striven only to enrich others. The book ends with the soaring notes of a socialist tribune of the people and the triumphant yell, thrice repeated, "Chicago will be ours." Before this happy ending, however, there is a passage that I'm surprised Jane Jacobs does not discuss. A bitter strike is in progress in the stockyards, and gangs of scabs are being mobilized. They're from the South, and they are different. Indeed, the reader is introduced to young white girls from the country rubbing elbows with big-buck Negroes with daggers in their boots, while rows of woolly heads peered down from every window of the surrounding factories. The ancestors of these black people have been savages in Africa, and since then they have been chattel slaves, or have been held down by a community ruled by the traditions of slavery. Now, for the first time, they were free to gratify every passion, free to wreck themselves. This is no slip of the pen on Sinclair's part. He elsewhere refers to a throng of stupid black Negroes, a phrasing that convicts him of pleonasm as well as of racism. It's often forgotten that the early American labor movement preached a sort of white socialism, and, though Debs himself didn't subscribe to it, that this sadly qualified its larger claim to be the liberator of the wage slaves. The final way in which Sinclair's realism got the better of his socialism is this. Like Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, he couldn't help being exceedingly impressed by the dynamic, innovative and productive energy of capitalism. No tiniest particle of organic matter was wasted in Durham's. Out of the horns of the cattle they made combs, buttons, hairpins, and imitation ivory. Out of the shin bones and other big bones they cut knife and toothbrush handles and mouthpieces for pipes. Out of the hooves they cut hairpins and buttons, before they made the rest into glue. From such things as feet, knuckles, hide clippings and sinews came such strange and unlikely products as gelatin, isinglass and phosphorus, bone black, shoe blacking and bone oil. They had curled hair works for the cattle tails and a wool pullery for the sheepskins. They made pepsin from the stomachs of the pigs and albumin from the blood, and violin strings from the ill-smelling entrails. When there was nothing else to be done with the thing, they first put it into a tank and got out of it all the tallow and grease, and then they made it into fertilizer. This account of the magnificent profusion that results from the assembly line and the division of labour is so awe-inspiring that Sinclair seems impelled to follow it almost at once with a correct and ironic discourse on the nature of monopoly and oligopoly. So guileless was he and ignorant of the nature of business that he did not even realize that he had become an employee of Brown's, and that Brown and Durham were supposedly by all the world to be deadly rivals, were even required to be deadly rivals by the law of the land, and ordered to try to ruin each other under penalty of fine and imprisonment. Thus, though it lives on many a veteran's bookshelf as a stirring monument to the grandeur of the American socialist and labour movements, The Jungle may also be read today as a primer on the versatility of the capitalist system. But not all its morals belong to the past. The anti-jungle ethos lived on in a subterranean fashion through the League for Industrial Democracy, founded by Sinclair and Jack London. Its junior branch, the Student League for Industrial Democracy, survived long enough to provide the auspices for the first meeting of students for a democratic society. In Eric Schlosser's bestseller Fast Food Nation, 2001, the values and practices of the slaughterhouse system were revisited. Most of the reviews, rather predictably, concentrated on the shock effect of Schlosser's intimate, almost intestinal depiction of hamburger ingredients. But Schlosser also spent a great deal of time with those whose lives are lived at the point of production. Recruited, often illegally, from the Central American Isthmus rather than the Baltic littoral, these workers are sucked into cutting machines, poisoned by chemicals, and made wretched by a pervasive stench that won't wash off. Their wages are low, their hours long, their conditions arduous, and their job security non-existent. The many women among them are considered bounty by lascivious supervisors who sometimes dangle the prospect of green cards or safer jobs, and sometimes don't bother even to do that. The health and safety inspectors are about as vigilant and incorruptible as they were a century ago. The main difference is that these plants are usually located in remote areas or rural states, so the consolations of urban and communal solidarity are less available to the atomized workforce than they were to Jurgis and his peers. This non-fiction work is also a blow to the national gut, but if properly read, it might succeed where the jungle failed, and bring our stomachs and our hearts, and even our brains, into a better alignment.